What does it mean to die 1,000 times and still remember the face of the man you swore to protect? Not in the way a soldier remembers a fallen commander, not with the comfortable distance of history, but with the raw, burning clarity of someone who watched the light leave his eyes, who felt the sand beneath his knees as he went down fighting, who carried that final image across death itself and woke up wearing a stranger's face in a tank full of alien fluid, and still felt the pull of that oath, like a hook through the chest. This is the story of Duncan Idaho, Swordmaster of Ginaz, shield of House Atreides, the most resurrected man in human history, and perhaps the most loyal soul the universe has ever produced, or the most tragic, depending on which life you catch him in. We are going to trace him across millennia. From the burning sands of Arrakis, where he made his first and most consequential sacrifice, through the grotesque miracle of Tleilaxu rebirth, across the suffocating centuries of Leto II's God Emperor tyranny, and finally out the other side of history itself, into a universe he helped shape without ever intending to. Close your eyes if you want. Let the story carry you. Duncan Idaho has been carrying this weight for thousands of years. The least we can do is walk beside him for a little while. To understand Duncan Idaho, you have to understand what the Swordmasters of Ginaz actually were. Not just in terms of combat technique, though we will get to that, but in terms of identity. In terms of what it meant to graduate from that school and carry that title. The school on Ginaz was not simply a military academy. It was a philosophical institution wrapped in the language of violence. Students who trained there were not merely learning how to kill efficiently. They were being shaped into something closer to living weapons with souls. Beings who understood that the highest expression of martial skill was not dominance, but service. The Swordmaster tradition demanded absolute commitment to a house, to a lord, to a cause larger than personal survival. And the graduates who emerged from that grueling training were, in the most literal sense, human shields designed to absorb whatever the universe threw at the people they protected. Duncan Idaho was not just a graduate of that tradition. By the time of Duke Leto Atreides I, Duncan was widely regarded as one of the finest products the school had ever produced. His instructors spoke of him in terms that went beyond technical skill. There was something in Duncan's particular combination of physical genius and emotional investment that set him apart. He did not merely excel at combat. He loved it the way an artist loves their medium, with a kind of ferocious tenderness that made him simultaneously dangerous and deeply human. He came to House Atreides as a young man and grew up inside it, not as a servant, but as something closer to a beloved member of an extended family. Duke Leto recognized this early and treated Duncan accordingly, not as a tool, but as a trusted advisor and companion. Paul Atreides, Leto's son and heir, practically worshiped Duncan in the way that children worship the adults who represent everything they want to become. Fierce but fair, skilled but never cruel, unbreakably loyal but never servile. That relationship between Duncan and Paul is crucial to understanding everything that comes after. Because the oath Duncan swore was not a cold, contractual obligation. It was the kind of oath that forms in the bone, the kind that you could not extract without killing the person entirely. When Duncan looked at young Paul Atreides, and then looked at Duke Leto, what he saw was something worth dying for. Not because he was ordered to feel that way, but because the Atreides household had earned it. And then came Arrakis. The Atreides moved to the desert planet under circumstances that anyone paying attention could see were designed to destroy them. The Emperor Shaddam IV had arranged the transfer of the Spice Planet from Harkonnen control to Atreides control as a trap, an elaborate political assassination wrapped in the language of imperial decree. Duke Leto knew it was a trap. His advisors knew. Duncan knew. They went anyway, because refusing would have been its own kind of defeat, and because the Atreides did not survive by running from impossible odds. What followed was the betrayal and the massacre. Harkonnen forces, aided by Imperial Sardaukar soldiers, swept through the Atreides position with overwhelming force. Duke Leto was killed. The household was shattered. Paul and his mother Jessica were driven into the deep desert. And Duncan Idaho died fighting a rearguard action to buy them time. He died buying time. That is the essential Duncan Idaho moment. Not in single combat with some great enemy. Not in a moment of theatrical heroism. He stood between the people he loved and the force that wanted them dead. And he held that line until there was nothing left to hold. The Sardaukar, who finally brought him down, reportedly required extraordinary numbers to do it. The accounts vary, but the combat data recorded by observers suggested that Duncan Idaho, in his final stand, killed more Sardaukar elite soldiers than any single fighter in recorded history up to that point. He died. And that death should have been the end. Except that someone had planned ahead. The Tleilaxu were among the strangest and most unsettling of the great human factions in the known universe. A race of genetic manipulators, biological architects operating at the edge of what most people considered morally permissible and well beyond what most considered spiritually acceptable. They had developed, among their many biological arts, a technology called the axolotl tanks. These were, in essence, artificial wombs of extraordinary complexity, capable of growing a genetic copy of a dead person from preserved tissue. They called these copies Gholas. And the word matters. Not clones, not resurrections in any religious sense, but Gholas, copies. New people grown from old flesh. The Tleilaxu were careful to distinguish their product from genuine resurrection, partly for theological reasons, and partly because the distinction was real. A Ghola was not the original person. It was a new consciousness grown in the precise physical form of someone who had died. It would carry no memories of its previous life. It would be born innocent of its own history, a blank page written in someone else's handwriting. At least, that was how it was supposed to work. What the Tleilaxu discovered, or perhaps what they engineered deliberately, was that Ghola memory restoration was possible under the right conditions. With sufficient psychological trauma, with the right triggers, the buried genetic memory of the original person could be unlocked, flooding the Ghola with a consciousness of who they had been. The experience was described by those who survived it as something between revelation and agony, like having a second self detonate inside your mind. The first Duncan Idaho Ghola was commissioned by the Tleilaxu themselves and eventually found its way to Paul Atreides, now transformed into Muad'Dib, ruler of Arrakis, and leader of a galaxy-changing religious revolution. The Ghola was given a different name, Hate, partly to signal his changed nature, and partly because the Tleilaxu had programmed him with a philosophical orientation and combat training that reflected Tleilaxu values as much as Atreides' ones. Paul recognized Duncan's face. The resemblance was perfect, of course. It had to be. It was grown from Duncan's own cells. And that recognition did something complicated to Paul. Something that the Tleilaxu had perhaps anticipated. Because the Hate Ghola, despite carrying no conscious memories of his previous life, was still Duncan Idaho in some deep structural sense. The same physical reflexes, the same underlying emotional architecture, the same tendency toward fierce, protective loyalty that had defined the original. The Tleilaxu had tried to reprogram him, and they had failed in the way that matters most. Memory restoration, when it came for that first Ghola, was triggered by one of the most painful moments in Paul's already devastated life. The trauma cracked the programming open, and Duncan Idaho came flooding back into the Ghola's awareness. All of him, the memories, the oaths, the love, the grief. He remembered dying. He remembered why. And he was still loyal. This is the first great mystery of Duncan Idaho. Not that the Tleilaxu could grow his body from preserved cells. That is just biology, strange and unsettling biology, but biology nonetheless. The mystery is that whatever the Tleilaxu did to the mind they built inside that body, whatever philosophical frameworks they installed, whatever loyalty redirecting conditioning they attempted, the fundamental Atreides orientation survived. It survived as if it had been written into the structure of his DNA, alongside the color of his eyes and the length of his bones. The oath was a genetic imprint, not metaphorically. In some real, functional sense, Duncan Idaho's commitment to the Atreides bloodline had become part of what he was at a cellular level. and the Tleilaxu would grow him again and again across the centuries, always hoping to use him, always discovering that they could not fully control what they had made. The centuries passed in the way that centuries pass when you are not living through them. For most of humanity, the rise and fall of Paul Muad'Dib and the jihad that swept across the stars in his name was history with a capital letter, the kind of thing that gets written in religious texts and argued over by scholars. For the Idaho Ghola line, it was something more intimate and more terrible. Leto II, the God Emperor, Paul's son, the child who, by the time of the events recorded in the book that bears his title, had been ruling the human universe for roughly 3,500 years. Let that settle for a moment. 3,500 years. Longer than the entirety of recorded human history from ancient Mesopotamia to the current day. One man, or rather one creature, that had been a man and then chosen to fuse with the sandworm, ruling absolutely, seeing everything, controlling the flow of spice and therefore the flow of civilization itself, guiding humanity along what he called the golden path. Leto II was not a tyrant in the simple sense. He was something far more disturbing, a tyrant who was right. His plan, the golden path, was designed to prevent the extinction of the human species by scattering humanity so thoroughly across the galaxy that no single force could ever again threaten its total annihilation. The prescient vision that had tormented his father Paul was, for Leto, a map to navigate by, a guide to the precise degree of suffering necessary to ensure long-term survival. The price of this plan was 35 centuries of brutal, suffocating control. No independent space travel, no military autonomy for any house or faction. Complete dependency on the God Emperor's favor. Humanity kept deliberately weak, deliberately dependent, so that when Leto finally died and the restrictions released, the scramble outward into the galaxy would be so desperate and so total that no one could ever herd humanity back into one place again. It was a plan of staggering scope and genuine compassion for the species, executed through means of genuine cruelty to the individuals who lived under it. And throughout this entire 3,500-year reign, Leto maintained a standing order for new Duncan Idaho Gholas from the Tleilaxu. Why Duncan? Of all the people in history that Leto could have chosen to resurrect again and again across millennia, why his father's Swordmaster? Why this particular soldier from a civilization that had been dust for 3,000 years? The answer Leto himself gave was practical. Duncan Idaho represented the finest product of the Ginaz combat tradition, a tradition that had subsequently been destroyed, meaning no new swordmasters of that quality could be trained. Keeping a Duncan Ghola around was, in purely military terms, having access to a weapon that could no longer be manufactured any other way. But Leto's explanations were never just practical. He was a being who thought in centuries and species, and his reasons for anything tended to operate on multiple levels simultaneously. The deeper reason, the one Leto himself came closest to admitting in his private journals. The journals that would eventually be compiled into the texts we know as the Stolen Journals, was that Duncan Idaho was the only person in the universe who could genuinely surprise him. Prescience is a prison. Leto knew this better than anyone. When you can see the probable futures, when you have lived long enough that human behavior becomes almost entirely predictable, the universe shrinks to a deterministic cage. Surprise becomes the rarest luxury imaginable. Duncan Idaho surprised Leto. Again and again and again. The same man, grown fresh from the same cells, shaped by the same basic personality matrix. And yet each new Ghola found slightly different ways to push back, to resist, to refuse. The soul that the Tleilaxu built into that body every time seemed constitutionally incapable of fully accepting the submission that Leto demanded from everyone else. Leto kept resurrecting Duncan because Duncan was the only mirror that reflected something real back at him, the only presence in the universe that reminded him, however painfully, that he had once been human. And because one suspects, Leto loved him. In the complicated possessive, genuinely felt way that a being of Leto's nature could love anything. He loved what Duncan represented. He loved the Atreides in him. He loved the stubborn, infuriating refusal to simply submit that characterized every Duncan Ghola from the first to the last. The experience of being a Duncan Idaho Ghola under Leto's reign was a specific kind of existential horror that deserves its own careful examination. Imagine waking up. You are in a body that feels perfectly natural to inhabit, your body. Every reflex and instinct orienting around a self that feels genuine. But the people around you keep calling you by a name that feels both completely yours and somehow borrowed. They tell you things about who you were, who you are, what you are for. The God Emperor himself, this vast, terrifying, half-worm creature who rules absolutely and sees everything, treats you with a familiarity that suggests history you cannot access, and then the memories come. Not gradually, not mercifully, all at once, triggered by some trauma designed to crack you open, and suddenly you are every Duncan Idaho who came before you, all their deaths, all their rebirths, all their accumulated grief and loyalty and rage, compressed into a single instant. The Tleilaxu claimed this process was reliable. They were lying, or at least overstating their control. The truth was that memory restoration in the Ghola process was more art than science, more brutal than precise, and the psychological aftermath was essentially uncharted territory, because the only person who could report on it was the Ghola himself, who was, by definition, not entirely objective about the experience. What the accounts suggest, pieced together from Duncan's own reflections and Leto's journal entries, is that each memory restoration was simultaneously a death and a birth. The new Duncan, the innocent Ghola who had been growing into his own identity, effectively ceased to exist when the old Duncan flooded back in. It was a kind of murder committed against yourself, by yourself, in the service of an oath you made before you were born. And then, after the restoration, there was the other knowledge, the knowledge of all the previous restorations. Not just one previous death to remember, but eventually dozens, then hundreds. A Duncan Idaho Ghola in the later centuries of Leto's reign carried the weight of an incomprehensible personal history. He remembered dying as the original Duncan Idaho on Arrakis. He remembered waking up as hate in Paul's court. He remembered every subsequent rebirth, every memory restoration, every adjustment and loss and terrible moment of recognizing that another version of himself had failed to do what needed to be done. The relationship between each Duncan Ghola and Leto was, to use a word that seems entirely inadequate, complicated. On the surface, Leto treated the Duncan Gholas with a kind of proprietary affection. He called Duncan his most faithful companion in documents that were clearly meant to be read eventually, if not by Duncan, then by history. He gave the Duncan Ghola positions of genuine authority, made him commander of the fish speakers, Leto's all-female military force, and consulted him on matters of policy in ways that suggested genuine respect for Duncan's judgment. Beneath the surface, the dynamic was far darker. Leto used the Duncan Gholas as breeding stock, not metaphorically. Part of the God Emperor's long genetic breeding program involved Duncan Idaho's particular combination of qualities, and Leto arranged for the Gholas to father children with specific women, contributing to the carefully managed human genetic pool that Leto was shaping across millennia. The Duncan Gholas were, in this sense, being used as biological instruments, their bodies deployed as tools in a project they had no say in designing. The tension between these two truths, that Leto genuinely valued Duncan and simultaneously used him as a resource, was something each Duncan Ghola had to navigate without going mad. Some of them managed it better than others. The accounts suggest that several Gholas reached a kind of armed equilibrium with Leto, a mutual acknowledgement that they were trapped together in something neither of them had entirely chosen, and that within that trap, a form of genuine connection was possible. Others burned with a rage they could not fully express against a god who could not be killed, because trying to kill Leto was essentially pointless. His worm body was nearly invulnerable. His prescience warned him of physical threats in most cases. And even if you somehow managed to damage him seriously, the result would not be freedom. It would be chaos, the immediate collapse of the system that kept billions of people alive. You could not kill the God Emperor without killing a significant portion of the human species along with him. The Duncan Gholas, who understood this, and they all eventually understood it, faced a kind of political and moral paralysis that was its own form of torture. The loyalty that burned in them toward the Atreides name could not find clean expression in a universe where the only surviving Atreides was also greatest tyrant humanity had ever known. And let us sit with that for a moment, because it is the philosophical core of everything Duncan Idaho represents. He was loyal to House Atreides. That loyalty was, as we have established, essentially indelible. It had survived death and rebirth and thousands of years and Tleilaxu conditioning programs. It was, functionally, who he was. And the surviving heir of House Atreides was Leto II, a creature who had fused himself with sandworm flesh, who ruled through terror and manipulation and the carefully calibrated distribution of suffering, who kept humanity deliberately infantilized for reasons that were genuinely good and genuinely monstrous at the same time. What does loyalty mean in that situation? What does it mean to be the shield of someone who has become the thing you were born to protect people from? This was the question that each Duncan Ghola circled around in his own way. The earlier Gholas tended toward a grudging acceptance, recognizing that the Atreides legacy was more complicated than simple heroism, that Duke Leto I himself had been a man capable of hard choices, that serving the Atreides had always meant serving something complex rather than something pure. The later Gholas, carrying more accumulated weight, tended toward a more active kind of resistance. Not violent rebellion, which, as we noted, was essentially impossible, but intellectual and moral resistance. A refusal to pretend that what Leto was doing was good when it was not. A maintenance of their own judgment, even within total submission. Duncan Idaho, across centuries of rebirths, became extraordinarily skilled at a very specific art, being authentically himself within a structure that was designed to erase authentic selfhood. He learned how to resist without rebelling, how to preserve his integrity without triggering the God Emperor's wrath, how to remain recognizably Duncan Idaho in a universe that was, in many ways, designed to produce more compliant material. Leto, predictably, found this both infuriating and deeply satisfying. It was exactly what he had bred the Duncan Ghola line to do. The combat evolution of the Duncan Idaho Ghola line across these millennia was something that even Leto found remarkable, and Leto was not easily impressed. The original Duncan Idaho had been a Swordmaster, meaning he had reached the highest level of the Ginaz combat tradition. That was already extraordinary. But the Ghola line did not stop there. Each successive Duncan inherited not just the body, but the accumulated combat data of every previous version, layered into muscle memory and neural architecture in ways that went beyond ordinary training. A Duncan Idaho Ghola in the 2000th year of Leto's reign could access combat techniques and tactical intuitions that had been refined across 150 generations of real combat experience. This made each new Duncan progressively more formidable in ways that were difficult to categorize. It was not merely that he was a better fighter. It was that the layers of accumulated experience had produced a kind of combat consciousness that operated below the level of deliberate thought, an intuition refined to near prescient levels without actually being prescient. Duncan could read situations, read opponents, read physical spaces, in ways that seemed almost magical to observers, but were actually the product of incomprehensible quantities of experience compressed into a single person's nervous system. Leto used this. Of course he did. But he also worried about it in the way that a god king can worry about the weapons he chooses to carry. A Duncan Idaho who had been refined across 2,000 years of rebirth and memory accumulation was not something that even Leto could fully predict or control. The very quality that made him valuable, his capacity for genuine autonomous judgment, was also the quality that made him dangerous. The tension between weapon and person, between tool and soul, was never resolved in the relationship between Leto and his Duncan Gholas. It simply persisted, a standing paradox at the heart of the God Emperor's reign. There came a point, described in the texts with unusual precision given how much of this history is fragmentary, when the nature of Duncan's loyalty underwent a fundamental shift. It is difficult to pinpoint exactly when this happened, because the shift was gradual, built up across multiple lifetimes and memory restorations. But the shape of it becomes clear when you look at what Duncan Idaho was actually defending toward the end of Leto's reign, versus what he had been defending at the beginning. At the beginning, the loyalty was personal and specific. Duncan Idaho, the original, had loved Duke Leto Atreides, the man, had loved young Paul Atreides, the boy, had loved the particular household and culture of a specific noble family on a specific planet in a specific historical moment. That loyalty was intimate, almost familial. It was the loyalty of someone who had been genuinely loved and loved genuinely in return. By the middle centuries of Leto's reign, that intimacy was no longer possible. The people Duncan had personally known and loved were dust. The civilization they had inhabited was a historical period being studied by scholars. The loyalty that remained could not any longer be personal in that direct sense. It had to become something more abstract, or it would simply evaporate. What it became was a loyalty to the principle that the Atreides had represented. Not to any specific Atreides, not even necessarily to the current one, who had become something so transformed as to be barely recognizable, but to the values that the Atreides household had embodied at its best. The idea that power should be exercised in service to something larger than the powerful. The idea that a leader's first obligation was to the people they led. The idea that honor and effectiveness were not opposites, but could, with sufficient care, be the same thing. Duncan Idaho became, across the centuries, the living embodiment of Atreides values at a time when the only surviving Atreides had transcended ordinary values entirely. He carried the flame forward, not always consciously, not always with clear articulation, but in the stubborn persistence of his own moral compass. And then, somewhere in the late centuries of Leto's reign, a further shift occurred. And the shift was this. Duncan stopped being loyal to the Atreides and started being loyal to humanity. Not in some grand, abstract sense. Duncan Idaho was never an abstract thinker in that way. He was always concrete, always grounded in the specific and the immediate. But gradually, across lifetimes, the question that animated his loyalty stopped being what serves the Atreides, and started being what serves the continuation of human life and human freedom. This was, in fact, what Leto had always intended. The Golden Path was not designed to produce a universe of grateful Atreides subjects. It was designed to scatter humanity so thoroughly that it could never be enslaved, never be threatened with extinction, never again be dependent on any single person or system for its survival. And the instrument of that plan, the one constant in 35 centuries of carefully managed change, was supposed to eventually understand and embody that goal. Leto needed Duncan to evolve beyond personal loyalty into species loyalty. And Duncan, despite everything, despite his rage and his grief and his unending exhaustion, eventually did. The final Duncan Idaho, who was present at Leto's death at the Stolen Journal's site, did not kill the God Emperor, though he was physically capable of the attempt by that point. He held back, not because he was afraid, not because he was still bound by the old personal loyalty, but because he understood, with the clarity of someone who had been thinking about this for 3,500 years, that the plan required Leto to die on its own terms. The God Emperor's death had to happen in a specific way, at a specific time, to trigger the specific cascade of events that would scatter humanity outward in the Great Scattering. Interfering with that, even with the best intentions, would be the worst thing Duncan could do for the species he had come to serve. So he watched, and he waited, and he let it happen. What comes after Leto's death is, in some ways, the most extraordinary phase of the Duncan Idaho story, and the one that is most difficult to summarize without doing it injustice. The scattering happened exactly as Leto had planned. Humanity exploded outward into the galaxy in every direction, fleeing the collapse of the system that had confined them for 35 centuries, spreading into regions so distant and so numerous that no empire could ever contain them again. The great game of centralized power that had dominated human civilization since its earliest days was over. Something new, something terrifyingly open and uncertain had begun. And Duncan Idaho was still alive. The Ghola line continued, or more precisely, a specific Duncan Idaho survived into the post-Leto period and found himself, for perhaps the first time in his existence, genuinely free. Free of the oath that had defined him. Because the Atreides as a governing dynasty were finished. Free of the Tleilaxu who had manufactured him because the old power structures that had sustained the Tleilaxu had collapsed. Free of the God Emperor's reign because the God Emperor was dead. What does a man defined entirely by loyalty do when there is no longer a defined object for that loyalty? This is the question that the later Dune novels, Heretics of Dune and Chapter House Dune, take as their central concern. The Duncan Idaho we encounter in those books is still recognizably himself, fierce, honorable, possessed of that same stubborn autonomy that had characterized every version of him. But he is operating in a context that is fundamentally new. Old hierarchies are gone, old certainties are gone. The universe is bigger and stranger and more chaotic than anything his original oath was designed to navigate, and he adapts. Because that, it turns out, is another of Duncan Idaho's essential qualities. Beneath the loyalty, beneath the oath, beneath the Swordmaster's discipline, there was always a fundamental adaptability, a capacity to engage with what is rather than what was. A refusal to be defeated by circumstances that were genuinely unprecedented. The Bene Gesserit, the ancient sisterhood of human women who had spent millennia developing mental and physical disciplines of extraordinary power, were deeply interested in the post-Leto Duncan Idaho. They recognized in him something that they could not quite replicate through their own training. The product of thousands of years of lived experience compressed into a single human consciousness. He was, in a sense, a walking archive of human possibility. The relationship between Duncan and the Bene Gesserit in these final recorded years of his story is its own complex negotiation. They wanted to use him, as everyone had always wanted to use him. He understood this, as he had always understood this. The question was whether the use served something worth serving. There was also the matter of Marbella, a Bene Gesserit student who became something far more complicated in Duncan's life, eventually joining the new sisterhood as one of its most significant figures. The relationship between Duncan and Marbella became one of the most intensely personal connections in his existence, precisely because it was not framed by the old Atreides loyalty. It was something he chose, with the full weight of his accumulated consciousness, because he chose it. For a man who had spent thousands of years in service to oaths made by someone who was no longer exactly him, the experience of choosing freely what to love and whom to protect was, one imagines, both exhilarating and terrifying. There is a thread running through the entire Duncan Idaho story that is easy to miss if you focus too much on the drama and the philosophy and the cosmic stakes. It is a quieter thread, but in some ways, the most important one. Duncan Idaho was always, at every point in this incomprehensible journey, doing his best. Not heroically, not transcendently, not with perfect clarity about what the best thing actually was. Just his human, fallible, desperately persistent best. He woke up in that tank, again and again, with no idea who he really was, and he oriented himself toward what felt most true and most worth serving, and he tried. That is the thing about genuine loyalty, genuine honor, of the kind the Ginaz tradition tried to cultivate. It is not about being right. It is not about being effective in some measurable way. It is about the continuous choice to direct yourself towards something outside yourself that you believe is worth serving, even when you are not sure it is. Even when the thing you are serving is complicated and flawed and sometimes terrible. Even when you are exhausted and grief-soaked and carrying the weight of 1,000 previous selves, Duncan Idaho kept choosing across centuries that would have broken any lesser soul, across deaths and rebirths that should have, by any reasonable accounting, eroded whatever made him who he was, across a relationship with a divine, monstrous Leto that was equal parts genuine connection and total mutual exploitation, across the end of everything he had originally sworn to protect and the beginning of everything he could not yet imagine. He kept choosing to be Duncan Idaho. And Duncan Idaho chose, always, to give a damn. In the final texts, the ones Frank Herbert wrote in the last years of his life, before his death in 1986, before he could complete the 7th novel that would have concluded the saga on his own terms, there are hints of where Duncan Idaho was headed that are tantalizing in their incompleteness. The Ithaca, the no-ship on which the surviving core of the Bene Gesserit and their allies fled the forces hunting them across the galaxy, carried among its complement the latest Duncan Idaho Ghola. A Duncan who had, by that point in the story, become something that even the accumulated history of the Idaho Ghola line had not produced before. A navigator of human possibility in the truest sense. Someone whose accumulated experience, whose capacity for genuine surprise even within prescient analysis, whose indelible loyalty to human survival over any particular human institution, made him uniquely suited to help chart a course through circumstances that no one had a map for. The great scattering that Leto had engineered was complete. Humanity was out there, scattered across distances, that made the old empire look like a single neighborhood. Return from that scattering was beginning. Strange humans with strange capabilities coming back from the dark, bringing with them challenges that none of the old institutions had been designed to face. And in the middle of all this, Duncan Idaho was still there, still trying to figure out what loyalty meant in a universe that had moved so far past the world, where his oath was made that the original terms of that oath were essentially archaeological. The answer he was finding, or rather the answer the texts suggest he was being guided toward, is beautiful in its simplicity after all the cosmic complexity that preceded it. Loyalty, at its most fundamental, is not about the specific object of your devotion. It is about the quality of your attention. The willingness to care, genuinely and persistently and at real cost to yourself, about something outside yourself. To refuse the comfortable descent into pure self-interest. To insist against all the evidence of a universe that is indifferent and chaotic and often cruel, that some things matter and are worth protecting. Duncan Idaho had served the Atreides. Then he had served the Atreides legacy. Then he had served humanity as an abstraction. And now, finally, in the vast and open universe that Leto's terrible gift had created, he was serving something even more fundamental. The ongoing human project of deciding together and imperfectly and without certainty what we actually want to be. Whew. And what of the man himself? Beneath all the history, beneath the accumulated weight of all those lives and deaths and rebirths, beneath the philosophical complexity of what his existence represented, Duncan Idaho was, in the end, someone who loved people. That was the original source of everything. He had loved Duke Leto with the uncomplicated admiration of a young swordmaster for a great lord. He had loved Paul with the fierce protectiveness of someone who had watched a remarkable child grow. He had loved the household, the culture, the specific texture of a particular human community that had been kind to him when kindness was not guaranteed. Everything else, the cosmic significance, the Ghola technology, the 35 centuries of God Emperor tyranny, the scattering of the human species across the galaxy, everything was built on that foundation. A man who could love, a man who, having loved, could not stop caring what happened to the people and the values that his love had attached itself to. The Tleilaxu thought they could grow a body and control the soul that inhabited it. They were wrong, not because souls are mystical or beyond biology, but because they underestimated how deeply love, once genuinely felt, restructures a person. They had preserved the biology of a man who had loved the Atreides with his whole being. They had no technology capable of extracting that love without destroying what made him valuable in the first place. So they grew him again and again, and discovered again and again that what they had made was still Duncan Idaho, still loyal, still fierce, still stubbornly, infuriatingly, beautifully himself. There's something in this story that speaks to questions we all carry, whether we live one life or 1,000. What is the self, if not the accumulated weight of every choice we have made and every love we have felt? If you stripped away my memories, if you rebuilt me from nothing but my physical structure, would you get something that was still recognizably me? Will the choices I have made be encoded somewhere in the way I am put together, insisting on themselves even when the conscious memory is gone? Duncan Idaho suggests the answer is yes, that the deepest commitments, the ones that are genuinely chosen rather than imposed, become structural. They become part of the architecture of the self in a way that survives even the most radical discontinuities. This is either terrifying or beautiful, depending on the quality of your commitments. If you have bound yourself to something worth binding yourself to, it is beautiful. You are, in some sense, indestructible. The thing you care about most will persist in you, past any destruction the universe can manage. If you have bound yourself to something petty or cruel or simply wrong, it is a warning. The Tleilaxu, who built Duncan Idaho, meant to create a tool. They created a person. The difference was in what the genetic material they were working with had chosen to love. Choose carefully what you love. It will still be there after everything else is gone. The stars that Duncan Idaho looked at from the sands of Arrakis in his first and most human life are different stars now. Not literally. Stars change slowly on human timescales. But the sky he sees has a different meaning, is legible in a different way, is connected to a different universe of human possibility than the one he was born into. He outlasted an empire. He outlasted a god. He outlasted the very civilization that his oath was sworn to protect. And he is still himself, still oriented by the values that were his before the Tleilaxu ever got involved, still looking out at the universe and asking, what is worth protecting here? What is worth the cost of caring? That question does not have a final answer. It never will. That is the nature of genuine loyalty, genuine devotion to something larger than yourself. It is an ongoing commitment, renewed moment to moment, life to life, in the face of a universe that will not stay still long enough to be served once and then forgotten. Duncan Idaho is not a man who solved the problem of loyalty. He is a man who kept solving it, over and over, in bodies that were his and were not his, in lives that were his and were not his, in a universe that kept changing faster than any oath could keep up with. And every time, he found his way back to something true, something worth standing for. Close your eyes if you have not already. Let the desert settle around you. The deep desert, the one that goes on past every horizon, past every known map, past every settled civilization, into the bare geological honesty of the planet that underlies all human ambition. In that desert, somewhere in the vast sweep of centuries, a man wakes up. He does not know yet who he is. He does not know yet what he carries. He has a body that feels completely natural to inhabit, and a vague sense of something enormous waiting at the edge of his awareness, pressing against the walls of his consciousness, like water against a dam. When the dam breaks, he will remember everything, every death, every rebirth. Every face of every Atreides he served and loved and failed and served again. The weight of it would crush most people into nothing. But he is not most people. He is Duncan Idaho. And Duncan Idaho picks up the weight, settles it across his shoulders with the practiced ease of someone who has done this many times before, and starts walking. There is always more to do. There is always someone worth protecting. The stars are very far away, and the universe is very large. And humanity is scattered across it in ways that make the old simplicities of a single noble house on a single desert planet seem like a child's drawing of what civilization could be, but the walking is the same. The orientation towards something worth serving is the same. The stubborn refusal to stop caring is the same. It was always going to be the same. Because some things, once truly chosen, do not need to be chosen again. They simply are. They persist. They walk forward through every death and every rebirth and every millennia of impossible history. Loyal, patient, indestructible. Duncan Idaho, Swordmaster of Ginaz, Shield of House Atreides, the most resurrected man in human history, and perhaps, in the end, the most fully human. Whew, rest now. The desert is quiet, the stars are watching. And somewhere out there, across distances that would make the old empire look like a single footstep, the walking continues.